Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another restful story from long ago. As the world outside grows still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a soft journey through history's quieter corners. Tell me, if you'd like, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought. All of us scattered across time zones sharing this moment. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, consider subscribing. There's so much more we'll uncover together in the nights to come. Meet Catherine de Medici, the woman they called the Poison Queen of France. But here's what's absolutely wild about her story. She wasn't born to rule France. She wasn't even French. Yet somehow this Italian banker's daughter became one of the most powerful and feared women in European history. And the methods she used to climb to power? Well, let's just say they make modern political scandals look like playground disputes. I'm about to walk you through the most jaw-dropping rise to power you've never heard of. And by the end of this series, you'll understand how one woman's ruthless ambition shaped the fate of an entire nation. But first, let me show you just how far Catherine was willing to go to protect her throne. Picture this. It's August 24th, 1572. The streets of Paris are about to run red with blood. Thousands of French Protestants, known as Huguenots, have gathered in the city for what they believe is a peaceful royal wedding. They have no idea they're walking into a trap. And at the center of this trap, Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother of France, who has just orchestrated what will become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. But Catherine's story doesn't start with mass murder. It starts with something far more relatable: rejection, humiliation, and the desperate need to prove herself worthy of a throne that never wanted her. Born in 1519 in Florence, Italy, Catherine de' Medici entered the world as an orphan. Her parents died within weeks of her birth, leaving her in the care of relatives who saw her primarily as a political pawn. The Medici family had built their fortune on banking, not bloodlines. They were wealthy, yes, but in the eyes of European royalty, they were still just merchants playing dress-up. When Catherine was barely 14 years old, she found herself shipped off to France like a piece of cargo, destined to marry the second son of King Francis I. This wasn't a fairy tale romance. This was a business transaction designed to secure an alliance between France and the Medici banking empire. Catherine brought with her a dowry so massive it could fund entire armies. But what she didn't bring was the one thing that mattered most in royal circles: respect. The French court despised her from the moment she arrived. They called her the merchant's daughter behind her back. They mocked her Italian accent, her unfamiliar customs, and most brutally of all, her inability to produce an heir. For 10 agonizing years, Catherine remained childless, while the whispers grew louder. The French nobility began demanding that her husband, who had now become the Dauphin, divorce her and marry someone who could actually fulfill a royal wife's most basic duty. But here's where Catherine's story takes its first dark turn. Instead of accepting defeat, she began studying, not literature or music like other royal women, but something far more dangerous. She became obsessed with the occult, with astrology, with alchemy, and most importantly, with poison. Catherine surrounded herself with a network of Italian alchemists, astrologers, and what we might today call chemical engineers. She learned which herbs could cure and which could kill. She discovered how to make potions that could induce fertility and others that could ensure a rival would never threaten her again. The French court began to notice that people who opposed Catherine had a disturbing tendency to fall mysteriously ill. Then in 1544, something miraculous happened. After a decade of trying, Catherine finally became pregnant, then pregnant again and again. Over the next 13 years, she would give birth to 10 children, securing her position as the mother of future kings. But was this sudden fertility the result of divine intervention, or had Catherine's studies in alchemy finally paid off? The French court never stopped whispering that Catherine had used dark magic to overcome her barrenness. And honestly, given what we know about her later actions, can you really blame them for being suspicious? By 1547, Catherine's husband had become King Henry II of France, making her queen consort. But even as queen, Catherine faced a humiliation that would drive her to increasingly desperate measures. Henry was completely infatuated with his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years older than Catherine, who wielded more influence over the king than his own wife. Diane didn't just share Henry's bed. She controlled his political decisions, managed state finances, and essentially ruled France, while Catherine was relegated to the role of royal baby-making machine. Imagine the rage, the humiliation, the burning need for revenge that must have consumed Catherine as she watched another woman live the life that should have been hers. But Catherine was patient. She watched, she learned, and she waited for her moment. That moment came in 1559 during a jousting tournament celebrating the marriage of Catherine's eldest daughter. King Henry, showing off for his beloved Diane, entered the lists against a younger opponent. The younger man's lance shattered against Henry's visor, sending splinters of wood directly into the king's brain. Henry lingered for 10 days before dying in agony. And suddenly, Catherine de Medici found herself exactly where she had always dreamed of being, in control of France. Her eldest son, Francis, became king, but at 15 years old, he was barely more than a child. Catherine, as Queen Mother, would be the real power behind the throne. But here's where Catherine's story becomes truly chilling, because now that she had power, she was absolutely determined never to lose it, and she would use any method necessary to hold on to it, no matter how many bodies piled up in her wake. Catherine's first challenge came from an unexpected source, her new daughter-in-law, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had married Catherine's son, Francis, and as the new Queen of France, she possessed both beauty and political cunning that threatened to overshadow Catherine entirely. Mary came from the powerful Guise family, French nobles who had their own ambitions for controlling the throne. The Guise family looked at Catherine and saw what they had always seen, a foreigner's daughter who had no business ruling France. They began maneuvering to push Catherine aside and govern through their niece Mary and her young husband, King Francis. But they had seriously underestimated the woman they were dealing with. Catherine had spent decades being underestimated, decades being dismissed, decades being humiliated. She had learned patience, cunning, and most importantly, she had learned that in the Game of Thrones, only the most ruthless players survive. The Guise family was about to discover that the merchant's daughter had become something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Within months of Henry's death, mysterious illnesses began plaguing members of the Guise faction. Political opponents found themselves suffering from sudden, inexplicable ailments that seemed to target anyone who dared challenge Catherine's authority. The whispers about the Poison Queen began in earnest, but Catherine's most brilliant move was yet to come. In December 1560, just 18 months after becoming king, her son Francis died suddenly of an ear infection. He was only 16 years old. With Francis dead, Mary, Queen of Scots, was no longer Queen of France, and the crown passed to Catherine's second son, the 10-year-old Charles IX. Now, Catherine was regent of France, the official ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. And unlike her previous position as Queen Mother, where she had to work behind the scenes, Catherine could now exercise power openly and without apology. The merchant's daughter had finally claimed her throne. But ruling France in the 16th century was like trying to control a powder keg while holding a lit match. The country was tearing itself apart over religion, with Catholic and Protestant factions engaging in increasingly violent conflicts. Catherine found herself caught between extremist Catholics who wanted to eliminate all Protestants from France, and growing Protestant communities who demanded equal rights and recognition. Any reasonable ruler might have sought compromise, might have tried to find middle ground between these warring factions. But Catherine de Medici was not interested in being reasonable. She was interested in maintaining power, and she quickly realized that the religious conflicts consuming France could be turned to her advantage. Catherine began playing both sides against the middle, supporting whichever faction served her immediate political needs while ruthlessly eliminating anyone who threatened her control. She would promise tolerance to the Protestants when she needed their support, then turn around and authorize brutal crackdowns when the Catholics demanded action. This wasn't inconsistency. This was calculated manipulation on a scale that would make Machiavelli himself take notes. Catherine understood that as long as Catholics and Protestants were fighting each other, neither faction would be strong enough to challenge her authority. She was deliberately keeping France in a state of controlled chaos because chaos served her purposes. But even Catherine couldn't control the forces she had unleashed forever. By the 1560s, France was descending into outright civil war. The wars of religion, as they would come to be known, would consume the country for decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And at the center of it all was Catherine de Medici, pulling strings, making deals, and eliminating anyone who stood in her way. The woman who had once been dismissed as a barren Italian merchant's daughter had transformed herself into one of the most feared rulers in European history. But her greatest test was still to come. Because in 1572, Catherine would orchestrate an event so shocking, so brutal, and so perfectly calculated that it would cement her reputation as the Poison Queen forever. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not a moment of religious passion or uncontrolled violence. It was a carefully planned political assassination on a scale that Europe had never seen before. And every drop of blood spilled that night can be traced directly back to Catherine's calculating mind. But to understand how Catherine could orchestrate such a massacre, you need to understand the woman she had become by 1572. This was no longer the frightened teenager who had arrived in France decades earlier. This was a master manipulator who had spent over 20 years studying her enemies, learning their weaknesses, and perfecting the art of political survival. Catherine had realized something that would shape the rest of her reign. In a world where women were expected to be powerless, the most dangerous weapon was to be underestimated. Let them think she was just a grieving mother, just a foreign intruder, just a woman trying to hold her family together. Meanwhile, she would be systematically eliminating every threat to her power with a precision that would make professional assassins jealous. By the early 1570s, Catherine had transformed the French court into something resembling a Renaissance version of a spy thriller. She maintained an elaborate network of informants who reported back to her on everything from private conversations to bedroom activities. Nothing happened in France without Catherine knowing about it, and more importantly, nothing happened without her permission. But Catherine's most ingenious creation was what historians would later call her flying squadron, a group of beautiful, intelligent noblewomen who served as her personal intelligence agents. These weren't just court ladies gossiping over embroidery. These were trained operatives who could seduce secrets from foreign ambassadors, manipulate rival nobles, and, when necessary, deliver poison with a smile. The most famous member of this squadron was Charlotte Dove, a stunning brunette who could make grown men forget their own names. Charlotte specialized in seducing Protestant leaders, gathering intelligence on their military plans, and occasionally ensuring that particularly troublesome individuals never made it home from their romantic encounters. Catherine had weaponized feminine charm and turned it into a tool of statecraft. Meanwhile, Catherine's son, Charles IX, was growing up under his mother's watchful eye, and what he was learning would have horrified any normal parent. Catherine wasn't just teaching him how to rule, she was teaching him how to kill without conscience, how to lie without hesitation, and how to see human beings as nothing more than chess pieces to be moved around the board. Charles watched his mother orchestrate the mysterious deaths of political rivals. He saw how she could smile warmly at someone during dinner, then have them dead by breakfast. He learned that mercy was weakness and that the only way to maintain power was through fear. Catherine was creating a monster, and she was proud of her work. But even with all her scheming and manipulation, Catherine faced a problem that was growing beyond her control. The Protestant movement in France, led by a group called the Huguenots, was becoming too powerful to ignore. These weren't just religious dissidents. They were wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen, and even some members of the nobility who had converted to the new faith. The Huguenots controlled entire regions of France. They had their own armies, their own fortified cities, and their own charismatic leaders who commanded fierce loyalty. Most dangerous of all, they were beginning to question not just Catholic religious doctrine, but the entire system of royal authority that kept Catherine in power. The leader of this Protestant movement was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a man who represented everything Catherine feared most. Coligny was brilliant, honorable, and completely incorruptible. He couldn't be bought, he couldn't be seduced, and he couldn't be intimidated. Worse still, he was gaining influence over Catherine's son, King Charles, offering the young king a vision of France that didn't require his mother's constant manipulation and control. Catherine watched in growing alarm as Charles began spending more time with Coligny, seeking his advice on military matters and even religious questions. The Admiral was offering Charles something Catherine never could, the possibility of being a truly independent ruler rather than a puppet dancing to his mother's strings. This was Catherine's nightmare scenario. She had spent decades carefully constructing a system where she controlled every aspect of French politics through her network of spies, assassins, and political marriages. Now, Coligny was threatening to tear down everything she had built by appealing directly to her son's conscience and sense of honor. Something had to be done about Admiral Coligny, but Catherine knew that simply assassinating the Protestant leader would create a martyr and potentially spark a full-scale revolution. She needed something more sophisticated, more final, more devastating. Catherine began developing what would become the most elaborate political trap in European history. The plan was breathtaking in its cynicism and terrifying in its scope. She would invite the Protestant leadership to Paris for a grand celebration, make them feel safe and welcome, then eliminate them all in one coordinated strike. The perfect opportunity came in 1572, when Catherine arranged the marriage of her daughter Marguerite to Henri of Navarre, a Protestant prince. This wasn't just a wedding. It was being presented as a symbol of religious reconciliation, a grand gesture showing that Catholics and Protestants could live together in harmony. Thousands of Huguenots traveled to Paris for the celebration, including Admiral Coligny and virtually every other major Protestant leader in France. They came believing they were attending a joyous occasion that would mark the beginning of a new era of religious tolerance. They had no idea they were walking into the most sophisticated death trap ever conceived. Catherine spent months planning every detail of what was to come. She coordinated with Catholic extremists in Paris, ensuring that weapons would be distributed and targets identified. She arranged for the city gates to be sealed so that no one could escape once the killing began. She even had lists prepared of every Protestant household in Paris, complete with addresses and the names of family members. But Catherine's masterstroke was her manipulation of her own son. King Charles was naturally reluctant to authorize mass murder. So, Catherine began a psychological campaign to convince him that the Protestants were plotting against his throne. She presented him with forged documents, false intelligence reports, and staged incidents designed to make him believe that Coligny and his followers were planning to overthrow the monarchy. Night after night, Catherine worked on her son's fears and insecurities. She reminded him of how the Protestants questioned royal authority. She painted vivid pictures of what would happen to him if they succeeded in their supposed rebellion. She convinced him that it was either kill or be killed, and that mercy would be seen as weakness by his enemies. Charles, barely 22 years old and completely under his mother's psychological control, finally cracked under the pressure. In a moment of rage and fear, he authorized Catherine to do whatever was necessary to eliminate the Protestant threat. He had no idea he had just signed death warrants for thousands of his own subjects. Catherine must have felt a surge of triumph as she received her son's authorization. After decades of careful planning and patient manipulation, she was finally in position to eliminate her enemies, once and for all. The merchant's daughter, who had been dismissed and humiliated, was about to demonstrate just how dangerous it was to underestimate Catherine de Medici. The wedding of Marguerite and Henri took place on August 18, 1572, and by all accounts it was a magnificent affair. The Protestant guests were treated with elaborate courtesy and hospitality. Catherine herself played the role of the gracious hostess, welcoming the Huguenot leaders as honored guests and speaking warmly about the bright future of religious cooperation in France. Admiral Coligny, the primary target of Catherine's hatred, was given a place of honor at the celebrations. He was staying in a house just a few hundred yards from the Louvre Palace, completely unaware that Catherine had already marked him for death. For several days, the city of Paris seemed to embody the spirit of reconciliation the royal wedding was supposed to represent. But beneath this facade of harmony, Catherine's agents were making final preparations for what was to come. Weapons were being distributed to Catholic militants throughout the city. Lists of Protestant households were being updated and confirmed. Secret meetings were being held to coordinate the timing of the attacks. The trap was set, and Catherine was ready to spring it. On August 22nd, just 4 days after the wedding, Catherine made her first move. As Admiral Coligny was walking through the streets of Paris, a shot rang out from a window above. The bullet struck Coligny in the arm and chest, wounding him severely but not killing him. The assassination attempt had failed, but Catherine was far from finished. The botched shooting actually played into Catherine's larger plan. She immediately rushed to Coligny's bedside, playing the role of the concerned mother-in-law and expressing her outrage that anyone would dare attack a guest at her daughter's wedding. She promised a thorough investigation and vowed to bring the perpetrators to justice. But privately, Catherine was telling her son, King Charles, that the failed assassination proved the Protestants were planning something desperate. She claimed that Coligny's supporters would certainly retaliate and that the royal family was now in mortal danger. The wounded admiral, lying in his bed, represented not a victim of Catholic violence, but a threat that had to be eliminated before he could strike back. Charles, already psychologically primed by months of his mother's manipulation, became increasingly agitated as Catherine painted scenarios of Protestant revenge. She convinced him that Coligny's followers would blame the royal family for the assassination attempt and would certainly try to kill him in response. The only way to prevent this, Catherine argued, was to strike first and strike decisively. On the night of August 23rd, Catherine finally revealed the full scope of her plan to her terrified son. It wasn't enough to kill Admiral Coligny. They had to eliminate the entire Protestant leadership while they were trapped in Paris. It was the only way to prevent civil war, she claimed. It was the only way to protect the throne. It was the only way to save France itself. King Charles, driven to the edge of a nervous breakdown by his mother's relentless psychological pressure, finally gave the order that Catherine had been waiting decades to hear. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre could begin. What happened next would forever stain Catherine de Medici's legacy and cement her reputation as one of history's most ruthless rulers. At approximately 2 in the morning on August 24, 1572, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll. This wasn't a call to prayer or a celebration of the recent royal wedding. This was the signal Catherine had arranged to begin the systematic slaughter of every Protestant in Paris. The first target was Admiral Coligny himself. A group of armed men, led by Henri de Guise, burst into the house where the wounded Protestant leader was recovering. They found Coligny in his bed, still weak from his injuries, completely defenseless against what was coming. The men dragged him from his room and threw him from the second-story window onto the cobblestones below, where a mob was waiting to mutilate his corpse. But Coligny's murder was just the beginning. Throughout Paris, Catholic militants, armed with lists provided by Catherine's agents, began systematically hunting down Protestant families. They moved through the city like a coordinated army, breaking down doors, dragging people from their beds, and killing entire households without mercy or hesitation. The violence wasn't random or spontaneous. This was Catherine's carefully orchestrated plan, playing out exactly as she had designed it. Protestant merchants were murdered in their shops. Protestant nobles were killed in their lodgings. Protestant women and children were slaughtered alongside their husbands and fathers. The streets of Paris literally ran red with blood as Catherine's death lists were methodically executed. What makes this massacre even more chilling is how Catherine maintained her facade of innocence throughout the entire ordeal. While thousands of her subjects were being butchered just outside her palace walls, she continued playing the role of the shocked and dismayed Queen Mother. She sent messages to Protestant leaders in other cities, expressing her horror at the violence and promising that the perpetrators would be punished. Meanwhile, her agents were secretly spreading word to Catholic strongholds throughout France that the Protestant leadership had been eliminated and that local Catholics should follow Paris' example. Catherine wasn't just orchestrating a massacre in the capital. She was triggering a nationwide extermination campaign that would claim tens of thousands of lives across France. The killing in Paris continued for 3 days. By the time it finally ended, an estimated 3,000 Protestants lay dead in the capital alone. Their bodies filled the Seine River, lined the streets, and created such a stench that residents had to burn incense just to breathe. Catherine de Medici had achieved something that no European ruler had attempted before: the systematic elimination of an entire religious community in a matter of hours. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the massacre wasn't the scale of the violence. It was Catherine's complete lack of remorse afterward. While Europe reacted with horror to news of what had happened in Paris, Catherine publicly celebrated the event as a great victory for Catholic France. She commissioned commemorative medals, ordered special church services, and even sent detailed accounts to foreign courts describing how successfully she had eliminated the Protestant threat. The woman who had once been dismissed as a powerless Italian intruder had just demonstrated that she was capable of orchestrating mass murder with the efficiency of a military campaign and the ruthlessness of a serial killer. The merchant's daughter had become something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, Catherine seemed to have achieved everything she had worked toward for decades. The Protestant movement in France was decapitated. The Huguenot political organization was destroyed. Most importantly, there was no longer any significant challenge to her control over her son and the French throne. Foreign courts throughout Europe sent congratulations to Catherine for her decisive action against heretics. Pope Gregory III ordered special celebrations in Rome. King Philip II of Spain praised her for striking such a blow against Protestantism. From a political perspective, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre appeared to be a complete success. But Catherine had underestimated the long-term consequences of what she had unleashed. The massacre didn't end the religious conflicts in France. It made them exponentially worse. Protestant communities throughout Europe were horrified by what had happened in Paris, and they began providing military and financial support to the surviving Huguenots. More importantly, Catherine had fundamentally changed the nature of religious warfare in France. Before the massacre, the conflicts had been primarily political disputes between competing noble factions. After August 1572, they became existential struggles between communities that could no longer trust each other to coexist peacefully. The surviving Protestants in France realized that Catherine's promises of tolerance were worthless. They had seen what happened when they trusted her assurances of safety. From now on, they would treat every Catholic overture as a potential trap and every peaceful gesture as a possible prelude to massacre. Catherine had also created a psychological precedent that would haunt France for generations. She had demonstrated that religious differences could justify any level of violence, that political problems could be solved through mass murder, and that entire communities could be eliminated in the name of state security. The techniques Catherine developed for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the use of wedding celebrations to lure victims, the coordination between government officials and religious extremists, the systematic preparation of death lists, the manipulation of popular fears to justify atrocities, would be copied by authoritarian rulers for centuries to come. But even as Catherine basked in the immediate political benefits of the massacre, she was creating new problems that would ultimately destroy everything she had worked to build. Her son, King Charles, traumatized by his role in authorizing mass murder, began suffering from severe psychological problems. He experienced nightmares, violent outbursts, and periods of deep depression that made him increasingly unstable as a ruler. Charles had been raised by Catherine to be ruthless, but witnessing the actual consequences of that ruthlessness broke something fundamental in his psyche. He began questioning his mother's advice, resenting her control over his decisions, and expressing guilt over the thousands of deaths he had authorized. The perfect puppet ruler Catherine had created was starting to develop a conscience, and that threatened everything she had accomplished. Meanwhile, the surviving Protestant leaders who had escaped the massacre were not simply accepting defeat and fading into obscurity. They were regrouping, rearming, and preparing for a war of revenge against Catherine and everything she represented. The Huguenot strongholds in southern France became centers of resistance, where Protestant military commanders trained armies specifically designed to march on Paris and overthrow the regime that had tried to exterminate them. Catherine found herself facing exactly the kind of organized Protestant rebellion that she had tried to prevent through the massacre. But now these rebels weren't fighting for religious tolerance or political rights. They were fighting for survival against a government they knew was perfectly willing to commit genocide. The irony of Catherine's situation would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. In trying to eliminate the Protestant threat through mass murder, she had created a far more dangerous and implacable enemy than had ever existed before. The scattered religious dissidents of the 1560s had been transformed into a unified military force dedicated to destroying the woman who had tried to destroy them. But Catherine de Medici was not a woman who admitted mistakes or changed course when faced with the consequences of her actions. Instead of recognizing that the massacre had been a strategic disaster, she doubled down on violence as the solution to her problems. If killing 3,000 Protestants hadn't solved the religious crisis, then she would simply have to kill more. Throughout the 1570s, Catherine continued authorizing military campaigns against Protestant strongholds. She funded Catholic armies that laid siege to Huguenot cities, burning entire communities and executing prisoners without trial. She maintained her network of assassins who targeted Protestant leaders throughout Europe. She even began exploring diplomatic alliances with other Catholic powers who might help her complete what the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had started. But each new atrocity only strengthened Protestant resolve and attracted more international support for the Huguenot cause. Catherine was trapped in a cycle of violence that she couldn't escape because she refused to acknowledge that violence itself was the problem. The woman who had once been so skilled at political manipulation was now reduced to crude brutality as her primary tool of statecraft. The subtle intelligence networks, psychological campaigns, and sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering that had brought her to power were being abandoned in favor of increasingly desperate attempts to murder her way out of the crisis she had created. By the late 1570s, it was becoming clear that Catherine's reign of terror was destroying the very kingdom she claimed to be protecting. France was bleeding out, money was drained from funding endless religious wars, the economy was collapsing as Protestant merchants and craftsmen fled the country, and entire regions were depopulated by violence and starvation. The sophisticated Renaissance court that Catherine had inherited was degenerating into something resembling a medieval warlord's stronghold. Yet Catherine remained convinced that she was the victim in this situation. In her correspondence with foreign rulers, she consistently portrayed herself as a long-suffering mother trying to hold her kingdom together against unreasonable Protestant extremists who refused to accept her generous offers of compromise. This capacity for self-deception was perhaps Catherine's most dangerous quality. She had so thoroughly convinced herself that her actions were justified that she seemed genuinely unable to understand why anyone would object to mass murder in the name of political stability. Catherine's psychological profile during this period reads like a textbook case study in narcissistic personality disorder combined with paranoid delusions. She saw enemies everywhere, interpreted any criticism as evidence of a conspiracy against her authority, and trusted no one completely. But even as Catherine's grip on reality loosened, her practical skills as a political operator remained formidable. She continued manipulating her children, managing complex international negotiations, and orchestrating military campaigns with the same attention to detail that had made the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre so devastatingly effective. The combination of strategic brilliance and moral blindness that characterized Catherine's later reign created a uniquely dangerous form of leadership. She possessed all the skills necessary to implement her vision for France, but that vision had become so warped by paranoia and bloodlust that it threatened to destroy the very kingdom she claimed to love. King Charles IX, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly under the psychological pressure of being Catherine's primary accomplice in mass murder. By 1574, he was experiencing what we would today recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from insomnia, violent nightmares, and episodes where he would rave about the ghosts of Protestant victims haunting the palace. Charles began making increasingly erratic decisions that undermined Catherine's carefully constructed political strategies. He would counter her orders, negotiate secretly with Protestant leaders, and publicly express regret for his role in the massacre. Catherine watched in growing alarm as her perfectly controlled puppet ruler began developing an independent moral compass. The final blow to Catherine's relationship with Charles came when he began seriously considering converting to Protestantism himself as a form of penance for the massacre. The idea that her own son might join the religious movement she had tried to exterminate represented the ultimate failure of Catherine's political project. Charles IX died in May 1574 at the age of 23, officially from tuberculosis, but quite possibly from the psychological trauma of living with his mother's legacy of mass murder. His final words were reportedly an apology to God for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and a plea for forgiveness for the innocent blood on his hands. With Charles dead, the crown passed to Catherine's third son, Henri III, who was currently serving as King of Poland. Catherine immediately began making plans to recall Henri to France and resume her role as the power behind the throne. She was 54 years old, had already buried two of her sons, and was facing the most serious political crisis of her career. But giving up was simply not in Catherine de Medici's vocabulary. The woman who had transformed herself from a despised foreign bride into the most feared ruler in Europe was not about to let something as minor as a collapsing kingdom and a trail of corpses stop her from continuing to pursue power. If anything, the chaos engulfing France only convinced Catherine that her iron-fisted approach was more necessary than ever. But Catherine was about to discover that even she had limits to how much destruction a single person could inflict before the very foundations of civilization began to crumble beneath her feet. Henri III's return to France in 1574 should have marked a fresh start for Catherine's political ambitions, but instead it revealed just how completely her reign of terror had poisoned the very concept of royal authority. The new king arrived to find a kingdom that barely resembled the sophisticated Renaissance court his mother had inherited decades earlier. Paris itself has become a city haunted by its own recent history. The neighborhoods where Protestant families had been slaughtered remained partially empty, their abandoned houses serving as grim reminders of what happened when people trusted Catherine's promises of safety. The same river, which had once carried the bodies of massacre victims, now seemed to flow with an undercurrent of fear that affected every aspect of daily life. But Catherine's most immediate problem wasn't the lingering trauma of the massacre. It was the fact that her new puppet king had ideas of his own about how France should be governed. Henry III had spent 2 years ruling Poland, where he had learned to appreciate the concept of religious tolerance and political compromise. He returned to France with a shocking notion that would horrify his mother. Maybe mass murder wasn't the best way to solve political problems. Henri's first major decision as king was to begin secret negotiations with surviving Protestant leaders about ending the religious wars that were bleeding France dry. He met with Huguenot representatives without Catherine's knowledge, offering genuine concessions and discussing the possibility of religious coexistence. For the first time in decades, it seemed like France might have a ruler who preferred diplomacy to death lists. Catherine was absolutely furious when she discovered what her son was doing. The woman who had spent her entire adult life believing that compromise was weakness could not comprehend why Henri would negotiate with people she considered terrorists and heretics. She began the same psychological manipulation campaign that had worked so effectively on his brother Charles, painting vivid pictures of Protestant treachery and warning Henri that mercy would be interpreted as weakness by his enemies. But Henry III was not the traumatized young man his brother had been. He was 23 years old, had already ruled a kingdom successfully, and possessed a confidence that made him less susceptible to his mother's emotional manipulation. When Catherine demanded that he authorize new military campaigns against Protestant strongholds, Henri refused. When she insisted that captured Huguenot leaders should be executed, Henri ordered them released. The perfect mother-son partnership that had orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was falling apart. Catherine found herself in the bizarre position of having to fight her own son for control of the kingdom she had spent decades trying to secure. The woman who had eliminated every external threat to her power was now facing the ultimate internal challenge. A king who no longer trusted her judgment and was actively working to undo her life's work. The conflict between Catherine and Henri created a power vacuum that was immediately filled by the most dangerous political movement France had seen in generations. The Catholic League, led by Henri de Guise, represented everything Catherine had always feared about religious extremism, but from the opposite direction. These weren't Protestant revolutionaries trying to overthrow the monarchy. These were Catholic fanatics who believed that Catherine and her sons weren't Catholic enough. The League looked at Catherine's reign and saw a woman who had compromised with heretics, allowed Protestant communities to survive, and failed to complete the religious purification that the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had begun. They demanded not just the elimination of Protestantism from France, but the removal of the entire Valois dynasty and its replacement with rulers who would show proper Catholic zeal. Henri de Guise, whose family had been manipulated and used by Catherine for decades, now emerged as her most formidable opponent. He possessed everything that made a dangerous political rival: noble bloodline, military experience, religious credibility, and, most importantly, genuine popular support among ordinary French Catholics who were exhausted by decades of religious warfare. Guise began holding massive rallies in Paris, where he condemned the Valois monarchy as weak, corrupt, and insufficiently committed to Catholic principles. He reminded audiences that it was his family, not Catherine's, that had actually carried out the killing during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. He suggested that France needed leaders who would finish what the massacre had started, rather than the half-hearted policies of compromise that Henry III was pursuing. Catherine watched in growing alarm as her carefully constructed political system began collapsing from multiple directions simultaneously. Protestant armies were advancing from the south, demanding revenge for the massacre and the overthrow of the regime that had authorized it. Catholic extremists were organizing in the north, demanding the removal of rulers they considered insufficiently zealous. And her own son, the king she was supposed to control, was pursuing policies that satisfied neither side, while making both groups more determined to destroy the monarchy entirely. The irony of Catherine's situation was almost poetic. The woman who had spent her entire career playing different factions against each other to maintain her own power was now watching those same factions unite in their hatred of her family. The divide-and-conquer strategy that had seemed so brilliant for decades was finally backfiring in the most spectacular way possible. But Catherine de Medici had not survived this long by accepting defeat gracefully. If her son wouldn't authorize the kind of decisive action she believed was necessary, then she would simply have to take matters into her own hands. At nearly 60 years old, the Poison Queen was about to demonstrate that she still possessed the ruthless cunning that had made her the most feared woman in Europe. Catherine's first target was Henri de Guise himself. She began developing an assassination plan that would eliminate the Catholic League's leadership, while making it appear that Protestant extremists were responsible. The scheme involved luring Guise to a private meeting at the royal palace, where Catherine's agents would kill him and then plant evidence suggesting that Huguenot assassins had infiltrated the court. But Catherine had underestimated how completely her reputation had preceded her. Guise was well aware of what had happened to previous political opponents who had accepted invitations to meet privately with the Queen Mother. He declined Catherine's invitation and began surrounding himself with bodyguards who were specifically trained to detect and counter the kind of subtle poisoning techniques that Catherine had perfected over the decades. Frustrated by her inability to eliminate Guise directly, Catherine shifted to a strategy that was even more dangerous. She began secretly negotiating with foreign powers about intervening in French politics. Spain's Philip II had been watching the French religious wars with great interest, seeing them as an opportunity to expand Spanish influence and eliminate France as a rival European power. Catherine's correspondence with Spanish agents during this period reveals just how completely her priorities had become divorced from any concept of French national interests. She was willing to accept Spanish military intervention, Spanish political control over French policy, and even Spanish oversight of the French succession, as long as these foreign allies would help her eliminate the Protestant movement and crush the Catholic League. The woman who had once been dismissed as a dangerous foreign influence in French politics was now actively inviting actual foreign domination as a solution to her domestic problems. Catherine had become so obsessed with maintaining power that she was prepared to destroy French independence rather than accept the possibility of losing control. Meanwhile, Henry III was desperately trying to hold his kingdom together through increasingly frantic attempts at political compromise. He offered concessions to Protestant leaders, then immediately contradicted those offers when Catholic extremists threatened rebellion. He promised religious tolerance in public speeches, then authorized military campaigns against Protestant strongholds when political pressure became unbearable. The young king, who had returned from Poland with such confidence, was being ground down by the impossible task of governing a kingdom that his mother had deliberately polarized beyond any hope of reconciliation. Every decision Henry made satisfied no one while enraging everyone, and he began showing signs of the same psychological stress that had destroyed his brother, Charles. Henry started experiencing panic attacks during public ceremonies, violent outbursts when discussing religious policy, and periods of deep depression where he would lock himself in his chambers for days at a time. The court physicians, who had learned to be very careful about what they said regarding royal mental health, began quietly discussing whether the king was having what we would today recognize as a complete nervous breakdown. Catherine watched her son's deterioration with a mixture of concern and opportunity. On one hand, Henri's psychological problems were making it impossible for him to provide the strong leadership that France desperately needed. On the other hand, his increasing instability created openings for Catherine to reassert her control over royal policy. She began positioning herself as the stable, experienced voice of reason who could guide the kingdom through its current crisis. Catherine started appearing at more public events, taking a more prominent role in diplomatic negotiations, and making speeches about the need for decisive action against France's enemies. The message was clear. If Henry III couldn't handle the responsibilities of kingship, his mother was prepared to step in and provide the leadership that the situation demanded. But Catherine's attempts to present herself as a stabilizing influence were undermined by the growing awareness among French nobles that she was the primary cause of the crisis in the first place. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had not occurred in some distant historical period. It was barely a decade in the past, and many of the people now dealing with its consequences had been present when Catherine orchestrated the killings. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments that Catherine de Medici had become a figure of almost universal hatred in France. Catholics blamed her for failing to complete the extermination of Protestantism. Protestants blamed her for attempting genocide against their communities. Moderate nobles blamed her for polarizing the kingdom beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Even members of her own court were beginning to distance themselves from a woman whose political legacy consisted primarily of mass murder and civil war. The isolation that Catherine experienced during her final years in power was perhaps the cruelest irony of her entire career. The woman who had spent decades building elaborate networks of allies, informants, and political partnerships found herself increasingly alone as former supporters abandoned her and potential new allies refused to associate themselves with her toxic reputation. Catherine's response to this isolation was to become even more paranoid and controlling than she had been during her previous decades in power. She began suspecting conspiracy everywhere, interpreting every political setback as evidence of elaborate plots against her authority. Her correspondence from this period shows a woman who had completely lost touch with political reality, seeing enemies in every shadow and betrayal in every disappointing outcome. The network of spies and informants that had once been Catherine's greatest political asset now became a source of constant anxiety as she received reports of growing opposition to her family's rule. Every conversation overheard by her agents, every private meeting discovered by her surveillance network, every rumor circulated among the nobility was interpreted through the lens of Catherine's increasing paranoia. She began authorizing arrests and interrogations based on the flimsiest evidence, often targeting people whose only crime was expressing mild criticism of royal policy in private conversations. The sophisticated intelligence apparatus that Catherine had built to protect her power was now being used to terrorize anyone who might potentially challenge her authority, creating a climate of fear that extended even to members of the royal court itself. But Catherine's most desperate and ultimately self-destructive decision during this period was her choice to eliminate Henri de Guise through a direct confrontation at the royal palace. In December 1588, Catherine convinced her son to summon Guise to a meeting at the Château de Blois, where royal guards would assassinate the Catholic League leader while he was supposedly under the protection of royal hospitality. The plan worked exactly as Catherine had designed it. Guise arrived at the palace expecting a routine political negotiation and was instead murdered by royal guardsmen who had been positioned throughout the building. But Catherine had fatally misunderstood the political climate in which she was operating. The techniques that had worked so effectively during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre were now being applied to a completely different situation, with catastrophic results. The assassination of Henri de Guise triggered exactly the kind of popular uprising that Catherine had spent her entire career trying to prevent. Paris erupted in riots as Catholic League supporters took control of entire neighborhoods, declared the Valois monarchy illegitimate, and began organizing military resistance to royal authority. Within days of Guise's death, Henry III and Catherine were forced to flee their own capital city as revolutionary crowds threatened to storm the palace and execute the entire royal family. Catherine de Medici, the woman who had once controlled France through an intricate web of political manipulation and carefully orchestrated violence, now found herself a refugee from the very kingdom she had spent decades trying to secure. The merchant's daughter, who had transformed herself into the most powerful woman in Europe, was reduced to hiding in provincial castles, while her enemies celebrated their victory in the streets of Paris. The final months of Catherine's life were spent watching everything she had worked to build collapse around her. Protestant armies advanced toward the capital from the south. Catholic League forces controlled Paris and were actively recruiting foreign military support to overthrow the monarchy. Her son, Henry III, was essentially king of nothing, commanding the loyalty of only a handful of nobles who remained committed to the Valois dynasty. Catherine's health began failing rapidly as the stress of political defeat, combined with the physical exhaustion of constant travel, and the psychological trauma of seeing her life's work destroyed, took its toll. She had always been a woman of tremendous physical and mental energy, but the combination of political failure and advancing age was finally taking its toll on someone who had spent over 40 years operating at the highest levels of European politics. On January 5, 1589, Catherine de Medici died at the age of 69 in the Château de Blois, the same palace where she had ordered the assassination that triggered her final political downfall. Her last words were reportedly a warning to her son about the dangers of showing mercy to political enemies. Advice that perfectly summarized the philosophy that had guided her entire approach to governing France. Catherine's death removed the last restraining influence on Henry III's increasingly erratic behavior. Within months of his mother's funeral, the king was making even more desperate political decisions, including an alliance with Protestant forces against the Catholic League that would have horrified Catherine. In August 1589, Henri III himself was assassinated by a Catholic extremist who considered the king a traitor to the faith. The death of Henri III marked the end of the Valois dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter in French history under Henri IV, the Protestant king, who would eventually convert to Catholicism and bring the religious wars to an end through the kind of political compromise that Catherine had always rejected. The woman who had tried to solve France's problems through mass murder and political terror was ultimately succeeded by a ruler who achieved peace through tolerance and negotiation. But Catherine's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of her actions. The techniques she had developed for political control, the use of intelligence networks to monitor potential opposition, the coordination of government policy with religious extremism, the manipulation of popular fears to justify authoritarian measures, and most importantly, the willingness to use mass violence as a tool of statecraft, would be studied and copied by ambitious rulers for centuries to come. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre became a template for politically motivated genocide that would be referenced during some of the darkest chapters in human history. Catherine's demonstration that religious differences could justify the systematic elimination of entire communities provided a precedent that would be cited by advocates of ethnic cleansing and religious persecution well into the modern era. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Catherine's career illustrated how quickly sophisticated political systems could be corrupted by leaders who prioritize personal power over moral constraints. The Renaissance court that she had inherited was a center of artistic achievement, intellectual advancement, and diplomatic sophistication. Under her influence, it became a machine for producing political terror and religious warfare. Catherine de Medici, transformation from a powerless foreign bride into the most feared ruler in Europe, represents one of the most complete examples in history of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. Her story serves as a warning about what happens when intelligence and determination are combined with moral blindness and unlimited ambition. The woman they called the Poison Queen had indeed poisoned more than her political enemies. She had poisoned the very concept of legitimate government, turning the French monarchy into something that inspired fear rather than respect and violence rather than loyalty. Her reign demonstrated that it was possible for a single individual to inflict damage on an entire civilization that would take generations to repair. Yet, Catherine's story also reveals something important about the nature of political power itself. Despite all her intelligence, all her cunning, and all her ruthless determination, she ultimately failed to achieve her most basic objective, securing the Valois dynasty's control over France. The very method she used to gain power eventually made it impossible for her family to retain that power. The lesson of Catherine de Medici's career is not that ruthless ambition cannot succeed in politics, but rather that success achieved through purely ruthless means tends to be self-defeating in the long run. The fear and hatred that Catherine generated through her reign of terror eventually created more enemies than even her formidable political skills could manage. Catherine's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between effective leadership and moral behavior. She was undeniably one of the most capable political operators in European history, possessing skills that allowed her to outmaneuver opponents, build complex alliances, and implement sophisticated strategies with remarkable success. But her moral blindness ultimately made all of those skills irrelevant. The merchant's daughter, who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of a throne she never inherited by birth, had indeed proven something about her capabilities. But what she proved was that it was possible to be simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, successful and ultimately self-destructive, feared and ultimately despised. Catherine de Medici's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that the question facing every political leader is not whether they have the skills to gain and maintain power, but whether they have the wisdom and moral courage to use that power in ways that actually serve the people they claim to represent. The Poison Queen had answered that question in the most definitive way possible, and the answer had poisoned everything she touched. Her story continues to fascinate historians and political scientists because it represents such a complete case study in the corruption of power and the self-defeating nature of political extremism. Catherine's reign provides a textbook example of how even the most sophisticated political strategies become counterproductive when they are divorced from any consideration of moral consequences. But perhaps the most important lesson of Catherine's career is that the techniques she pioneered for maintaining political control through fear and violence did not die with her. The methods she developed for manipulating public opinion, eliminating political opposition, and using religious extremism as a tool of statecraft have been refined and employed by authoritarian leaders throughout history. Understanding Catherine de Medici's story is therefore not just an exercise in historical curiosity, but a crucial part of recognizing and resisting the kinds of political manipulation that continue to threaten democratic societies today. The Poison Queen's legacy lives on wherever leaders choose power over principle, fear over hope, and violence over justice. The woman who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a foreign merchant's daughter had indeed changed the course of European history, but not in the way she had intended. Instead of securing her family's dynasty, she had demonstrated the ultimate futility of trying to build lasting political success on a foundation of mass murder and moral corruption. Catherine de Medici's reign stands as one of history's most powerful arguments for the proposition that how we achieve power matters just as much as whether we achieve it, and that the methods we use to govern ultimately determine whether our legacy will be one of progress or destruction. The devastating irony of Catherine's final years becomes even more apparent when we examine what happened to the kingdom she had sacrificed everything to control. By 1589, France was in such complete chaos that foreign observers wondered if the nation would simply cease to exist as a unified political entity. The sophisticated Renaissance monarchy that Catherine had inherited from her father-in-law, Francis I, had been transformed into something resembling a collection of warring medieval fiefs. Consider the perspective of ordinary French citizens during this period. Marie Dubois was a baker's wife living in Lyon, one of France's most prosperous cities. In 1559, when Catherine first became regent, Marie's family had enjoyed the stability and prosperity that came with living in a well-governed Renaissance kingdom. The Dubois bakery served customers from across the social spectrum, from wealthy merchants to struggling artisans, all of whom could afford bread because the French economy was fundamentally sound. By 1589, Marie's world had been completely destroyed by Catherine's reign of terror. 3 of her sons had died in religious wars. Her husband had been conscripted into a Catholic League militia that spent more time looting than fighting. The bakery had been burned down twice, first by Protestant raiders and then by Catholic extremists who suspected the family of harboring Huguenot sympathies. Marie spent her final years as a refugee in her own country, moving from town to town with whatever possessions she could carry, never knowing whether the next group of soldiers she encountered would protect her or kill her, based on their interpretation of her religious loyalties. The stable, prosperous France of her youth had been replaced by a hellscape where survival depended on correctly guessing which faction controlled whatever territory you happened to be crossing. Stories like Marie's were replicated hundreds of thousands of times across France during Catherine's reign. Entire regions that had been centers of commerce and culture were depopulated by violence, disease, and starvation. Cities that had been architectural marvels were reduced to rubble by successive sieges. The sophisticated road networks that had connected French communities were abandoned because travel had become too dangerous for ordinary civilians. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Catherine's legacy was what happened to the concept of royal authority itself. For centuries, French kings had been regarded by their subjects as legitimate rulers appointed by God to govern with wisdom and justice. Even during periods of political conflict, there had been a fundamental assumption that the monarchy represented stability and continuity in French society. Catherine's reign had completely shattered that assumption. By the time of her death, the French monarchy was seen by most of the population as nothing more than another armed faction, competing for control through violence and intimidation. The sacred nature of royal authority had been permanently damaged by Catherine's demonstration that kings and queens were just as capable of mass murder as any common criminal. The psychological damage Catherine inflicted on French society extended beyond the immediate trauma of religious warfare. She had fundamentally altered how French people thought about political power, religious identity, and social cooperation. The Renaissance optimism that had characterized early 16th century France, with its belief in human reason and the possibility of progress, had been replaced by a deep cynicism about human nature and political institutions. Jean-Baptiste Marot was a young philosophy student at the University of Paris when Catherine orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. He had been studying the humanist texts that celebrated human dignity and the possibility of creating just societies through rational discourse and mutual understanding. The morning after the massacre, Jean-Baptiste walked through streets littered with the corpses of people whose only crime had been belonging to the wrong religious community. The experience destroyed Jean-Baptiste's faith in the Renaissance ideals he had been studying. He abandoned his philosophical pursuits and spent the rest of his life as a bitter, cynical merchant who trusted no one and expected the worst from every political situation. His personal transformation mirrored what was happening to French society as a whole under Catherine's influence. The intellectual and cultural achievements that had made 16th century France a center of European Renaissance culture were systematically destroyed by the climate of fear and violence that Catherine had created. Artists fled the country rather than risk being caught up in religious persecution. Scholars abandoned their research to focus on basic survival. The patronage networks that had supported cultural innovation were disrupted by constant warfare and economic collapse. Catherine had not just failed to secure her dynasty's political control over France, she had actively destroyed the foundations of the civilization she claimed to be protecting. The Renaissance kingdom she had inherited was replaced by something that resembled the darkest periods of medieval barbarism, but with the added efficiency that came from applying Renaissance organizational skills to the task of mass destruction. The international consequences of Catherine's reign were equally devastating for French interests. European powers that had once regarded France as a sophisticated ally or formidable rival now saw it as a chaotic, failed state that posed no serious threat to anyone except its own population. Spain, England, and the German principalities began making plans for partitioning French territory once the kingdom finally collapsed completely. Ambassador reports from this period reveal the complete collapse of France's diplomatic credibility. Foreign courts that had once competed for French alliances now avoided association with a regime that was internationally synonymous with political incompetence and religious fanaticism. Catherine's reputation as the Poison Queen had become so notorious that other European rulers worried about being contaminated by any connection to her family. The economic consequences of Catherine's policies were perhaps even more destructive than the immediate political chaos. France had been one of Europe's wealthiest kingdoms at the beginning of Catherine's regency, with thriving commercial networks, productive agricultural regions, and innovative manufacturing centers. By the end of her reign, the French economy had contracted by an estimated 40%, with entire industries disappearing and formerly prosperous regions reduced to subsistence-level poverty. Consider what happened to the French textile industry, which had been one of the kingdom's most important sources of wealth and international trade. Protestant merchants and craftsmen had played crucial roles in developing innovative production techniques and establishing trading relationships with foreign markets. Catherine's persecution of Huguenot communities destroyed much of this expertise and commercial infrastructure. Pierre Fontaine had been a master weaver in the city of Tours, where his family had been producing luxury fabrics for 3 generations. His workshop employed over 50 people and sold textiles throughout Europe. Pierre's Protestant faith made him a target during the religious wars, and in 1576, his entire operation was destroyed by Catholic League militants who accused him of using his commercial contacts to fund Huguenot military activities. Pierre escaped with his life, but lost everything else. His skilled workers were scattered, his equipment was destroyed, and his commercial relationships were severed. He spent his remaining years as a day laborer, watching as the French textile industry that his family had helped build was systematically dismantled by the religious conflicts Catherine had deliberately encouraged. Similar stories played out across every sector of the French economy. Banking networks that had facilitated international trade were disrupted by religious persecution. Agricultural productivity declined as farming communities were repeatedly devastated by military campaigns. Urban centers that had been engines of innovation became depopulated ruins where survivors focused entirely on basic survival. The demographic impact of Catherine's reign was equally catastrophic. Historians estimate that France's population declined by approximately 15% during the 3 decades of religious warfare that she either directly caused or deliberately prolonged. This wasn't just a matter of battlefield casualties. Entire regions experienced population collapse due to disease, starvation, and mass migration. The city of La Rochelle provides a particularly stark example of this demographic catastrophe. In 1560, La Rochelle had been a thriving port city with over 30,000 residents engaged in international commerce, shipbuilding, and related industries. The city's Protestant majority made it a target for Catherine's persecution, and by 1590, the population had fallen to fewer than 8,000 survivors, living in a partially ruined urban landscape. What happened to La Rochelle's missing 22,000 residents? Some died in military campaigns. Others succumbed to the plagues that regularly swept through areas disrupted by warfare. Many simply fled the country, taking their skills and resources to Protestant strongholds in the Netherlands, England, or German territories, where they could practice their religion without fear of massacre. This pattern of population loss and economic disruption was replicated throughout France, creating a downward spiral where violence led to economic collapse, which created desperation that fueled more violence. Catherine had trapped her kingdom in a cycle of self-destruction that seemed impossible to break through conventional political means. But perhaps the most profound way Catherine damaged French civilization was through her corruption of the moral and intellectual framework that held society together. Renaissance France had been characterized by a complex but functional system of mutual obligations and shared values that allowed people with different backgrounds and beliefs to coexist within a common political framework. Catherine's reign demonstrated that these social bonds were far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Her deliberate strategy of encouraging extremism to maintain her own power showed how quickly a sophisticated society could degenerate into tribal warfare when its leaders abandoned any pretense of serving the common good. The legal system that had been one of France's most impressive institutional achievements was completely corrupted by Catherine's reign. Courts that had been respected for their fairness and expertise became instruments of political persecution, where verdicts were determined by religious identity rather than evidence. The tradition of legal scholarship that had made French universities centers of European jurisprudence was abandoned as lawyers focused on survival rather than intellectual advancement. François Liberton had been a respected judge in the Paris Parliament, known for his careful analysis of legal precedents and his reputation for impartiality. During Catherine's reign, François was forced to participate in show trials where Protestant defendants were condemned regardless of the evidence. He watched his profession degenerate from a learned pursuit dedicated to justice into a crude tool for religious persecution. François's personal journals from this period reveal the psychological toll of being forced to participate in a system he knew was fundamentally corrupt. He describes the shame of rendering verdicts he knew were unjust, the fear of being accused of insufficient Catholic zeal, and the gradual erosion of his belief in the possibility of fair legal proceedings. By the end of Catherine's reign, François had become a broken man who drank heavily and avoided social contact because he could no longer bear to face the families of people he had been forced to condemn. The educational system that had made France a center of European intellectual life suffered similar corruption under Catherine's influence. Universities that had been dedicated to free inquiry and scholarly debate became centers of religious indoctrination, where questioning official doctrine could result in imprisonment or death. The humanist curriculum that had encouraged critical thinking was replaced by narrow theological training designed to produce religious extremists rather than educated citizens. Professor Antoine Rousseau had taught rhetoric and philosophy at the University of Orléans for over 20 years when Catherine's reign began. He had been known for encouraging students to examine different philosophical traditions and to develop their own reasoned positions on complex questions. During the religious wars, Antoine was forced to abandon this approach in favor of rote memorization of Catholic doctrine. Antoine's correspondence reveals his despair at watching his students transform from curious young scholars into rigid fanatics who were more interested in identifying heretics than in pursuing knowledge. The intellectual excitement that had characterized his early career was replaced by a dreary routine of indoctrination that served Catherine as political needs, but destroyed the educational mission he had devoted his life to serving. The artistic and cultural achievements that had made the French Renaissance court a model for European civilization were similarly destroyed by Catherine's reign. The patronage system that had supported painters, musicians, architects, and writers was disrupted by constant warfare and the climate of fear that made artistic expression dangerous if it could be interpreted as politically or religiously subversive. Marguerite de Navarre the Younger, a poet and playwright who had been one of the most celebrated artists of her generation, found herself unable to continue her creative work during Catherine's reign. Her poetry, which had explored themes of love, spirituality, and human nature, was deemed potentially heretical by religious authorities who examined every artistic work for signs of Protestant sympathies. Marguerite spent her final years in self-imposed silence, destroying manuscripts she feared could be used as evidence against her and avoiding the literary circles where she had once been a central figure. The vibrant cultural life that had flourished during the early French Renaissance was replaced by a sterile environment where artistic expression was subordinated to religious and political orthodoxy. The architectural projects that had been transforming French cities into showcases of Renaissance design were abandoned as resources were diverted to military fortifications, and the funds that had supported cultural patronage were consumed by the costs of constant warfare. The chateaux that had been symbols of French sophistication were converted into military strongholds or left to decay as their owners fled the country or died in religious conflicts. Catherine's impact on French religious life was equally destructive, but in ways that went far beyond the immediate violence of the religious wars. The sophisticated theological traditions that had characterized both French Catholicism and the early Protestant movement were replaced by crude extremism that emphasized hatred of religious opponents rather than spiritual development or intellectual understanding. The monastery of Saint-Denis, which had been a center of Catholic scholarship for centuries, was transformed during Catherine's reign into something resembling a military recruiting center where monks spent more time planning attacks on Protestant communities than studying scripture or serving the poor. The intellectual tradition that had produced some of Europe's most respected theologians was abandoned in favor of inflammatory preaching designed to encourage violence against religious minorities. Father Guillaume Marron had been a respected scholar at Saint-Denis, known for his commentaries on medieval theology and his efforts to promote understanding between different Christian traditions. During Catherine's reign, Guillaume was pressured to abandon his scholarly work in favor of delivering sermons that portrayed Protestants as demonic enemies who deserved extermination. Guillaume's private writings reveal his horror at being forced to preach hatred rather than love, and his growing conviction that Catherine's manipulation of religious feelings was fundamentally anti-Christian. He died in 1585, reportedly of a broken heart, after watching his beloved monastery transform into an institution he no longer recognized. The Protestant communities that survived Catherine's persecution were similarly damaged by the extremism her policies encouraged. Churches that had emphasized education, social service, and theological reflection became militarized organizations focused primarily on physical survival. The intellectual achievements of early French Protestantism were largely lost as communities devoted all their resources to military resistance. Pastor Jean Calvin the Younger, son of the famous reformer, had been working to develop a sophisticated Protestant theological tradition that could engage intellectually with Catholic scholarship while maintaining Reformed principles. Catherine's persecution forced him to abandon this work in favor of organizing military resistance and providing pastoral care to communities under constant threat of massacre. Jean's later writings reflect his bitterness at seeing his life's work destroyed by political circumstances beyond his control. The theological synthesis he had hoped to create was never completed because the intellectual environment necessary for such work had been destroyed by Catherine's reign of terror. The long-term consequences of Catherine's destruction of French intellectual and cultural life extended far beyond her own lifetime. France, which had been positioned to become the leading center of European Renaissance culture, instead fell behind other nations that had managed to avoid similar periods of internal chaos and religious warfare. The Netherlands, which welcomed many French Protestant refugees, experienced a cultural golden age during the late 16th and early 17th centuries that was fueled in part by the talents and resources that had fled Catherine's persecution. England, which had managed its own religious conflicts more successfully, began to surpass France in areas like literature, philosophy, and scientific innovation. France would eventually recover from Catherine's reign and go on to achieve new cultural heights during the 17th century. But the Renaissance momentum that had been building during the early 16th century was permanently lost. The kingdom that should have been leading European civilization instead spent decades rebuilding from the devastation that one woman's ruthless ambition had inflicted. Catherine's personal responsibility for this cultural catastrophe cannot be understated. She had inherited a kingdom that was well positioned to become the dominant force in European Renaissance culture, with established traditions of intellectual excellence, artistic innovation, and international influence. Through her deliberate choices, she transformed that inheritance into a legacy of violence, extremism, and civilizational decline. The woman who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of royal authority had instead demonstrated how quickly even the most sophisticated political systems could be destroyed by leaders who prioritized personal power over the common good. Catherine's reign stands as one of history's most complete examples of how individual moral corruption can inflict damage on entire civilizations that takes generations to repair. But even as Catherine's legacy of destruction became increasingly apparent during her final years, she remained convinced that her methods were not only justified, but necessary for protecting France from its enemies. Her correspondence from the 1580s shows no recognition of the role her own policies had played in creating the chaos that was consuming the kingdom she claimed to love. This capacity for self-deception was perhaps Catherine's most dangerous quality, and it helps explain how someone with such obvious intelligence and political skill could consistently make decisions that were so obviously self-destructive. She had created a psychological framework that allowed her to interpret any criticism of her methods as evidence of her enemies' unreasonable hatred rather than legitimate concerns about her policies. Catherine's final letters to foreign rulers reveal a woman who genuinely believed she had been a successful monarch who had protected France from religious extremism and foreign domination. She seemed incapable of recognizing that the extremism and chaos that characterized her final years were largely the product of her own political choices rather than external forces beyond her control. This psychological blindness made Catherine particularly dangerous because it prevented her from learning from her mistakes or adapting her strategies when they proved counterproductive. A ruler with normal capacity for self-reflection might have recognized that the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had backfired and adjusted their approach accordingly. Catherine instead doubled down on violence and extremism because she couldn't acknowledge that her original strategy had been fundamentally flawed. The tragedy of Catherine's reign was not that she was incompetent or lacking in political skills. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most capable political operators of her era, with an impressive ability to analyze complex situations, develop sophisticated strategies, and implement her plans with remarkable attention to detail. Her failure was moral rather than intellectual, stemming from her complete inability to consider the human cost of her political ambitions. This combination of exceptional ability and moral blindness made Catherine far more dangerous than a simple tyrant or incompetent ruler would have been. She had all the skills necessary to implement her vision for France, but that vision was so warped by paranoia and ruthless ambition that it threatened the very foundations of the civilization she claimed to be protecting. The lesson of Catherine's career is not that political skill is unimportant, but rather that skill without moral guidance becomes a force for destruction rather than progress. Her story serves as a permanent reminder that the question facing every political leader is not whether they have the ability to gain and maintain power, but whether they have the wisdom and character to use that power in ways that actually serve their people's interests. Catherine de Medici had answered that question through her actions, and the answer had poisoned everything she touched. The merchant's daughter, who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of royal authority, had instead provided one of history's most compelling arguments for why moral character matters more than political skill in determining whether a leader will be remembered as a blessing or a curse to their people. Her reign demonstrated that it was possible to be simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, successful in the short term and ultimately self-defeating, feared by enemies and despised by subjects. Catherine had achieved a kind of political success, but at a cost that made that success worthless, both for herself and for the kingdom. She had sacrificed everything to control. The Poison Queen's legacy would outlive her by centuries, serving as a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the devastating consequences of leadership divorced from moral constraint. But in the immediate aftermath of her death, France faced the urgent task of somehow recovering from the damage she had inflicted and rebuilding the foundations of civilized society that her reign had systematically destroyed. The man who would ultimately end Catherine's reign of terror was someone she had never expected to threaten her power. Henri of Navarre, the Protestant prince who had married her daughter Marguerite during that fateful wedding celebration in 1572, had somehow survived the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and spent the following years building exactly the kind of coalition that Catherine had always feared most. But Henri wasn't just another Protestant rebel leader seeking revenge for past atrocities. He was something far more dangerous to Catherine's legacy, a genuinely skilled politician who understood that France's salvation lay not in more violence, but in the radical concept of religious tolerance. While Catherine had spent decades trying to solve political problems through assassination and massacre, Henri was quietly demonstrating that compromise and coexistence might actually work. Picture the scene in 1589 as Henri of Navarre prepared to march on Paris to claim the throne that had become his by right after Henry III's assassination. This wasn't a vengeful Protestant army seeking to burn down Catholic churches and slaughter innocent civilians. This was a disciplined military force led by a man who had learned from Catherine's mistakes and was determined not to repeat them. Henri's army included both Protestant and Catholic soldiers who had grown exhausted with the religious warfare that had consumed their lives for decades. These weren't fanatics driven by theological hatred, but practical men who simply wanted to live in a kingdom where they could practice their faith, support their families, and pursue their trades without fear of being murdered by their neighbors. Captain Pierre Moreau was a Catholic officer who had joined Henri's army after watching his hometown of Chartres change hands 6 times during the religious wars. Each transition had brought new waves of persecution, revenge killings, and economic disruption that made normal life impossible for ordinary citizens. Pierre didn't particularly care about Protestant theology, but he had become convinced that Henri offered the only realistic hope for ending the cycle of violence that Catherine's policies had created. Pierre's decision to support a Protestant king, despite his own Catholic faith, represented a fundamental shift in how French people were thinking about politics and religion. Catherine had spent her entire career trying to convince the population that religious differences made political cooperation impossible. Henri was proving that shared citizenship and common interests could be more powerful than theological disputes. Meanwhile, in the papal palace at Rome, Pope Sixtus V was facing a diplomatic crisis that perfectly illustrated how completely Catherine's policies had backfired. The Pope had initially supported Catherine's persecution of French Protestants, believing that religious unity was essential for political stability. By 1589, he was watching Catholic League extremists threaten to tear apart the very Catholic monarchy that their persecution had been designed to protect. Cardinal Alessandro Peretti, the Pope's nephew and closest advisor, had been receiving increasingly alarming reports from France about the Catholic League's activities. These weren't the disciplined defenders of Catholic orthodoxy that Rome had expected to support. They were armed fanatics who seemed more interested in looting and settling personal scores than in advancing any coherent religious or political program. And Alessandro's correspondence reveals his growing horror as he realized that Catherine's approach to religious conflict had created exactly the kind of chaos that undermined both royal authority and Catholic interests. The cardinal began secretly advising his uncle to consider supporting Henri of Navarre's claim to the French throne, even if it meant accepting a Protestant king, because the alternative seemed to be the complete collapse of organized government in France. This shift in papal thinking represented a devastating repudiation of everything Catherine had claimed to be fighting for. She had justified decades of persecution and massacre as necessary to protect Catholic interests and maintain religious unity. Now the head of the Catholic Church himself was beginning to question whether her methods had actually strengthened or weakened the cause she claimed to serve. But perhaps the most powerful indictment of Catherine's legacy came from the ordinary French people who had lived through her reign of terror and were finally being offered an alternative. When Henri of Navarre issued his famous declaration promising religious tolerance and an end to persecution, the response from war-weary communities across France was overwhelmingly positive. Marie Blanchard was a Catholic seamstress living in the city of Rouen. When Henri's declaration reached her community, Marie had lost 2 sons in religious warfare, had seen her neighborhood burned by Protestant raiders, and had watched Catholic extremists execute her Protestant neighbors during a particularly vicious outbreak of sectarian violence. She had no particular love for Protestant theology, but she was desperate for any leader who promised to end the cycle of killing that had dominated her adult life. Marie's reaction was typical of millions of French citizens who had grown exhausted with the religious extremism that Catherine's policies had encouraged. These people weren't interested in complex theological debates or sophisticated political theories. They simply wanted to live in a kingdom where they could worship according to their conscience, earn a living through honest work, and raise their children without fear of religious persecution. Henri of Navarre understood this popular longing for peace and stability in ways that Catherine never had. While she had always seen religious differences as irreconcilable conflicts that could only be resolved through the elimination of one side or the other, Henri recognized that most people cared more about practical concerns like security, prosperity, and family welfare than about abstract theological disputes. This insight would prove to be the key to Henri's success and the foundation of his eventual transformation into Henri IV, one of France's most beloved kings. But in 1589, as he prepared to challenge the chaos that Catherine's reign had created, Henri first had to overcome the military and political obstacles that stood between him and the throne he was determined to claim. The Catholic League that controlled Paris was led by Charles of Mayenne, Henri de Guise's brother, who had inherited both his family's political ambitions and their hatred for the Valois dynasty. Mayenne had built a formidable military coalition that included Spanish financial support, papal blessing, and the enthusiastic participation of Catholic extremists who viewed Henri's Protestant faith as an absolute disqualification for royal authority. But Mayenne had also inherited the fundamental weakness that had ultimately doomed Catherine's political strategy. His movement was defined primarily by what it opposed, rather than what it stood for. The Catholic League could unite around hatred for Protestant heretics and disgust with royal weakness, but it had no coherent vision for how France should actually be governed once its enemies were eliminated. Father Louis Richomme was a Jesuit priest who had initially supported the Catholic League because he believed that religious orthodoxy was essential for social stability. As he watched Mayenne's forces occupy Paris and begin implementing their vision of Catholic governance, Father Louis became increasingly disturbed by what he witnessed. The Catholic League's rule in Paris was characterized by the same kind of arbitrary violence and extremist rhetoric that had marked Catherine's worst periods of religious persecution. Suspected Protestant sympathizers were arrested on the basis of anonymous denunciations. Catholic moderates who advocated for political compromise were accused of insufficient religious zeal. The sophisticated legal and administrative systems that had made Paris a center of European civilization were replaced by revolutionary tribunals that rendered verdicts based on religious and political orthodoxy rather than evidence or established law. Father Louis's private journals from this period reveal his growing conviction that the Catholic League had become something fundamentally anti-Christian in its methods, even as it claimed to be defending Christian principles. He describes watching League militants torture prisoners to extract confessions of heresy, witnessing summary executions of people whose only crime was advocating for religious tolerance, and seeing Catholic churches transformed into centers of political indoctrination rather than spiritual worship. The priest's disillusionment with Catholic extremism was shared by increasing numbers of French Catholics who had initially supported the League but were horrified by its actual practices. Catherine's strategy of encouraging religious fanaticism to serve her political purposes had created a monster that even many Catholics found repulsive and dangerous. Meanwhile, Henri of Navarre was demonstrating through his own conduct that Protestant leadership didn't necessarily threaten Catholic interests or French traditions. His army maintained strict discipline, protected Catholic churches and monasteries, and treated captured enemies with a degree of mercy that stood in stark contrast to the behavior of Catholic League forces. Jean-Baptiste Fontaine was a Catholic nobleman who had been captured during one of Henri's military campaigns and expected to be executed as an enemy of the Protestant cause. Instead, he found himself treated as an honored prisoner of war, allowed to attend Catholic Mass, and eventually released without ransom as a gesture of goodwill toward Catholic communities that might be considering whether to support Henri's claim to the throne. Jean-Baptiste's experience convinced him that Henri represented a fundamentally different approach to political leadership than what France had experienced during Catherine's reign. This wasn't a ruler who saw political opponents as enemies to be eliminated, but someone who understood that lasting political success required building bridges between different communities rather than burning them down. The contrast between Henri's approach and Catherine's legacy became even more apparent when Henri issued his famous declaration that Paris is worth a Mass. This wasn't just a cynical political calculation, though it was certainly that. It was also a demonstration of the kind of practical flexibility that Catherine had never possessed and that France desperately needed if it was going to recover from decades of religious warfare. Henri's willingness to convert to Catholicism in order to unite the kingdom represented everything Catherine had claimed to want but had never been able to achieve. She had spent her entire career trying to create Catholic unity through persecution and violence. Henri accomplished the same goal through compromise and inclusion, demonstrating that her methods had been not just morally wrong, but strategically counterproductive. Cardinal Arnaud d'Ossat was the papal representative who negotiated Henri's conversion and reconciliation with the Catholic Church. The cardinal had been deeply skeptical of accepting a formerly Protestant king, but his correspondence reveals his growing admiration for Henri's genuine commitment to religious tolerance and political moderation. Cardinal d'Ossat's reports to Rome emphasized that Henri's conversion wasn't just a political convenience, but reflected a sincere desire to heal the wounds that religious conflict had inflicted on French society. The new king demonstrated his commitment to Catholic interests, while simultaneously protecting Protestant communities from the kind of persecution that had characterized Catherine's reign. This balancing act required political skills of the highest order, and Henri's success in maintaining it demonstrated just how unnecessarily destructive Catherine's approach had been. She had always claimed that religious coexistence was impossible and that political stability required the elimination of religious diversity. Henri proved that both claims were false by creating exactly the kind of religiously diverse but politically unified kingdom that Catherine had insisted could never exist. The economic recovery that began under Henri's rule provided perhaps the most damning evidence of how completely Catherine's policies had failed even on their own terms. She had justified decades of persecution and warfare as necessary to protect French interests and maintain political stability. The immediate improvement in economic conditions, once Henri ended religious persecution, demonstrated that Catherine's methods had been the primary obstacle to French prosperity and security. Guillaume Mercier was a merchant in the city of Lyon, who had watched his business collapse during the religious wars as trade networks were disrupted by constant warfare and religious persecution. Under Henri's rule, Guillaume found that Protestant and Catholic merchants could once again cooperate in commercial ventures without fear that religious differences would lead to violence or legal persecution. Guillaume's account books from this period show a dramatic increase in both domestic and international trade as confidence returned to French markets. Foreign merchants who had avoided France during Catherine's reign began returning as word spread that the new king offered genuine protection for commercial activities, regardless of the participants' religious affiliations. The revival of French commerce under Henri's tolerant policies provided concrete evidence that Catherine's approach to religious diversity had been economically as well as morally catastrophic. The kingdom that she had claimed to be protecting through persecution had actually been systematically weakened by her methods, while the religious tolerance she had always rejected proved to be the foundation of renewed prosperity. Henri's success in rebuilding French civilization also highlighted how completely Catherine had misunderstood the nature of political authority and the sources of legitimate government. She had always believed that fear was the most reliable foundation for political control, that subjects needed to be intimidated into obedience, and that mercy was a sign of weakness that encouraged rebellion. Henri demonstrated that exactly the opposite was true. His willingness to forgive former enemies, protect religious minorities, and govern through persuasion rather than coercion created a kind of popular loyalty that Catherine had never achieved despite decades of effort. French people supported Henri not because they were afraid of him, but because they trusted him to govern in their interests, rather than purely for his own political advantage. This popular support gave Henri a kind of political strength that Catherine had never possessed, even at the height of her power. She had always ruled through complex networks of allies who supported her because they feared the consequences of opposition or hoped to benefit from her favor. Henri ruled through genuine popular consent from subjects who believed that his success was connected to their own welfare. The contrast was most visible in how the two rulers dealt with political opposition and dissent. Catherine had consistently responded to criticism with violence, treating any questioning of her policies as evidence of treasonous conspiracy that needed to be eliminated through assassination or persecution. Henri actively encouraged debate and discussion, recognizing that legitimate opposition could actually strengthen his government by forcing him to consider different perspectives and adjust his policies when they proved ineffective. Professor Antoine Rabelais was a scholar at the University of Paris who had been forced into exile during Catherine's reign because his writings on political philosophy were deemed too sympathetic to Protestant ideas about religious tolerance and limited government. Under Henri's rule, Professor Rabelais was able to return to France and resume his scholarly work without fear of persecution. Professor Rabelais' later writings provide a detailed analysis of the differences between Catherine's authoritarian approach and Henri's more consultative style of governance. He describes how Henri actively sought advice from scholars, merchants, and other educated citizens, treating their expertise as a valuable resource rather than viewing their independence as a threat to royal authority. This willingness to listen to criticism and incorporate different perspectives into government policy represented a fundamental rejection of everything Catherine had believed about political leadership. She had always seen governance as a zero-sum competition, where any limitation on royal authority represented a dangerous concession to potentially rebellious subjects. Henri understood that effective governance required building consensus and cooperation rather than simply imposing the ruler's will through force. Henri's success in rebuilding French institutions demonstrated that Catherine's authoritarian methods had been not just morally questionable, but practically counterproductive. The religious settlement that Henri negotiated through the Edict of Nantes in 1598 stands as perhaps the most complete repudiation of Catherine's entire approach to religious diversity. Where she had insisted that religious unity could only be achieved through the elimination of religious minorities, Henri created a legal framework that protected both Catholic and Protestant communities while maintaining overall political unity. The edict granted French Protestants the right to worship freely in designated areas, hold public office, maintain their own schools and universities, and even garrison certain fortified cities for their protection. At the same time, it reaffirmed Catholicism as the official religion of France and guaranteed Catholic control over most public institutions. This compromise satisfied neither religious extremists on either side, but it created exactly the kind of stable, prosperous, and peaceful kingdom that Catherine had always claimed to be working toward. The fact that Henri achieved through tolerance and compromise what Catherine had failed to accomplish through decades of persecution and violence provided a devastating critique of her entire political philosophy. Pastor Samuel Bochart was a Protestant minister who had spent Catherine's reign hiding in caves and abandoned buildings to avoid the persecution that had driven most of his colleagues into exile or to their deaths. Under Henri's rule, Pastor Bochart was able to establish a thriving congregation in the city of Caen, where Protestant and Catholic citizens coexisted peacefully and often collaborated on community projects. Pastor Bochart's sermons from this period emphasized themes of reconciliation, forgiveness, and the possibility of building a society based on mutual respect rather than religious hatred. His success in attracting both Protestant and Catholic audiences to interfaith discussions about moral and social questions demonstrated that the religious antagonism Catherine had always assumed was inevitable was actually largely the product of her own policies. The cultural renaissance that flourished under Henri's rule provided additional evidence of how completely Catherine's reign had stifled French intellectual and artistic development. The climate of fear and persecution that had characterized her later years was replaced by an environment that encouraged creativity, innovation, and the kind of cultural exchange that had made early 16th century France a center of European Renaissance achievement. Playwright Jean Dier was one of many artists who returned from exile to contribute to the cultural revival that marked Henri's reign. His comedies and tragedies explored themes of religious reconciliation, political wisdom, and the possibility of healing the wounds that decades of civil war had inflicted on French society. Jean's most successful play, The Merchant of Rouen, told the story of a Catholic businessman and his Protestant partner who overcome religious prejudice to build a successful commercial enterprise that benefits their entire community. The play's popularity demonstrated popular hunger for narratives that emphasized cooperation and mutual understanding, rather than the religious hatred that Catherine's reign had encouraged. The scientific and intellectual achievements that began to emerge under Henri's rule also highlighted how much potential Catherine's policies had wasted. French scholars who had spent decades focused on basic survival or religious controversy were finally free to pursue the kind of innovative research that had characterized the early Renaissance period. Mathematician François Viète made groundbreaking contributions to algebra and trigonometry that established France as a leader in mathematical innovation. His work was possible only because Henri's government provided the kind of stable, tolerant environment that allowed scholars to focus on intellectual pursuits rather than religious and political survival. Viète's correspondence reveals his gratitude for being able to work in a kingdom where scholarly merit was valued regardless of religious affiliation, and where intellectual inquiry was encouraged rather than viewed as potentially subversive. His achievements represented the kind of cultural flowering that might have occurred decades earlier if Catherine had chosen tolerance over persecution as her governing philosophy. The international reputation that France began to recover under Henri's rule provided perhaps the most objective measure of how completely Catherine's reign had damaged the kingdom's standing in European affairs. Foreign courts that had spent decades viewing France as a source of instability and religious fanaticism began to see it once again as a sophisticated ally and cultural leader. Ambassador Sir Henry Wotton represented English interests at Henri's court and sent detailed reports to London describing the transformation he witnessed in French society. His dispatches emphasized the dramatic improvement in economic conditions, the restoration of effective government institutions, and the renewal of cultural and intellectual life that characterized Henri's reign. Sir Henry's observations were particularly valuable because he had also served in France during Catherine's final years and could provide direct comparisons between the two periods. His reports consistently emphasize that the positive changes under Henri weren't simply the result of ending warfare, but reflected fundamental differences in governing philosophy and political method. The English ambassador was particularly impressed by Henri's ability to maintain political unity while protecting religious diversity, something that English observers had long considered impossible based on their experience of French religious wars. Henri's success challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between religious uniformity and political stability that had shaped European political thinking for generations. Similar reports from Spanish, Italian, and German observers confirmed that Henri had accomplished something unprecedented in European politics: the creation of a stable, prosperous kingdom that protected both religious minorities and majority interests without sacrificing either political authority or economic development. These international assessments provided objective confirmation that Catherine's methods had been not just morally wrong, but strategically counterproductive. The kingdom she had weakened through decades of persecution and civil war was rapidly becoming stronger and more influential under a ruler who embraced the religious tolerance she had always rejected. But perhaps the most powerful vindication of Henri's approach came from the simple fact that ordinary French people were finally able to live normal lives without constant fear of religious persecution or political violence. Families that had been separated by religious warfare were reunited. Communities that had been devastated by sectarian conflict began to rebuild. Economic activities that had been disrupted by constant uncertainty resumed and flourished. Claude Bernier was a farmer in Normandy who had watched his village change hands multiple times during the religious wars. with each transition bringing new waves of persecution, property confiscation, and forced religious conversion. Under Henri's rule, Claude was able to focus on agricultural improvement and community building rather than religious and political survival. Claude's letters to his brother in Paris describe a transformation that went far beyond simple political stability. He writes about Protestant and Catholic neighbors cooperating on harvest activities, attending each other's family celebrations, and working together on community projects like road maintenance and school construction. This kind of practical cooperation between religious communities represented exactly the kind of social healing that Catherine had always insisted was impossible. Her entire political philosophy had been based on the assumption that religious differences made peaceful coexistence unachievable and that lasting political stability required religious uniformity enforced through persecution and violence. Henri's success in creating religiously diverse but socially unified communities demonstrated that Catherine's assumptions had been fundamentally wrong. Religious tolerance didn't weaken political authority or threaten social stability. It actually strengthened both by allowing citizens to focus their energy on productive activities rather than sectarian conflict. The children who grew up under Henri's rule represented perhaps the most hopeful aspect of his achievement. These young people had no personal memory of the religious hatred and political violence that had characterized Catherine's reign. They were raised in communities where religious diversity was accepted as normal and where cooperation across religious lines was an everyday reality rather than an impossible dream. Marie-Jeanne Dubois was born in 1595, 7 years after Henri became king. She grew up in a mixed religious community where her Catholic family maintained close friendships with Protestant neighbors, attended each other's weddings and funerals, and collaborated on business ventures without religious considerations playing any significant role in their relationships. Marie-Jeanne's childhood experiences represented everything Catherine had tried to prevent through her policies of religious persecution and enforced uniformity. The young woman grew up assuming that religious tolerance was natural and normal, that political authority could coexist with religious diversity, and that social cooperation was possible despite theological differences. This generational change represented Henri's most important long-term achievement and the most complete repudiation of Catherine's legacy. He had created not just political stability, but a new kind of French society where the religious fanaticism that had dominated Catherine's reign seemed like a historical aberration rather than an inevitable aspect of human nature. The France that Henri left to his successors was fundamentally different from the kingdom that Catherine had tried to create through decades of persecution and violence. It was a nation where religious minorities felt secure, where economic development flourished, where intellectual and artistic achievement was encouraged, and where political authority rested on popular consent rather than fear. Henri's assassination in 1610 by a Catholic fanatic named François Ravaillac demonstrated that the religious extremism Catherine had encouraged had not been completely eliminated from French society, but the overwhelming popular grief that followed Henri's death, including mourning from both Protestant and Catholic communities, showed how successfully he had built a unified kingdom based on tolerance and mutual respect. The contrast between popular reactions to Henri's death and the general indifference that had greeted Catherine's passing 21 years earlier revealed everything about the differences between their approaches to political leadership. Catherine had been feared and occasionally respected, but she had never been genuinely loved by her subjects in the way that Henri was mourned by people from all social classes and religious communities. This difference in popular affection reflected the fundamental distinction between rulers who govern through fear and those who govern through consent, between leaders who see their subjects as potential enemies to be controlled, and those who treat them as fellow citizens whose welfare is connected to their own success. Henri's legacy would shape French political development for centuries to come, establishing traditions of religious tolerance, economic development, and cultural achievement that would make France a leading European power. Catherine's legacy, by contrast, served primarily as a cautionary tale about the destructive potential of political extremism and moral corruption. The woman who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of royal authority through ruthless determination and political cunning had instead demonstrated how quickly even the most sophisticated civilizations could be damaged by leaders who prioritized personal power over moral principle. Her reign stood as a permanent reminder that political skill without moral wisdom was not just inadequate, but actively dangerous to the societies that such leaders claim to serve. But Catherine's story also illustrated something important about the resilience of human civilization and the possibility of recovery from even the most destructive political experiences. The France that emerged from her reign of terror was ultimately stronger and more humane than the kingdom she had inherited, not because of her contributions, but because leaders like Henri IV had learned from her mistakes and chosen fundamentally different approaches to the challenges of governance. The merchant's daughter, who had transformed herself into the most feared woman in Europe, had indeed changed the course of history, but not in the way she had intended. Her legacy served not as a model for future rulers to emulate, but as a warning about the consequences of allowing ambition to overwhelm conscience and political calculation to replace moral consideration. Catherine de Medici's reign would be remembered not for the dynasty she had tried to secure or the enemies she had eliminated, but for the devastation she had inflicted and the lessons her failures had taught about the essential connection between moral leadership and lasting political success. The Poison Queen had indeed poisoned her era, but from that poison had eventually emerged a deeper understanding of what responsible governance required and what happened when those requirements were ignored. Her story remained relevant not because her methods were worth copying, but because the temptations she had succumbed to, the desire for absolute control, the willingness to sacrifice moral principles for political advantage, the belief that fear was more reliable than trust as a foundation for authority, were permanent features of political life that every generation of leaders would need to recognize and resist. The transformation of France from Catherine's reign of terror to Henri's era of tolerance demonstrated that even the most damaged societies could heal if their leaders possessed the wisdom to choose cooperation over conflict, inclusion over persecution, and hope over fear. But it also showed how much unnecessary suffering could be inflicted when leaders made the opposite choices, and how long it could take to repair the damage that moral blindness and political extremism could inflict on entire civilizations. The irony of Catherine's legacy becomes even more profound when we examine what happened to the very concept of royal motherhood that had once defined her identity and justified her most extreme actions. Catherine had always portrayed herself as the ultimate protective mother, willing to do anything necessary to secure her children's futures and preserve the dynasty she had sacrificed everything to establish. Yet by the time of her death, Catherine had become something that would have horrified the young Italian bride, who had once desperately wanted nothing more than to produce healthy heirs. She had transformed into a mother whose protective instincts had become so twisted by paranoia and ambition that she was actively destroying the very children she claimed to be protecting. Consider what happened to her surviving sons during those final chaotic years. Henry III, who had returned from Poland with such promise and confidence, was reduced to a nervous wreck who jumped at shadows and trusted no one. The psychological pressure of being Catherine's puppet ruler while trying to navigate the impossible political situation she had created was literally driving him insane. The king, who should have been in the prime of his political career, spent his days locked in his chambers, consulting astrologers and fortune-tellers in desperate attempts to understand why everything seemed to turn to disaster. Henri's courtiers reported that he would sometimes spend entire nights pacing his rooms, muttering about the ghosts of massacre victims and the curse that seemed to follow his family wherever they went. But perhaps the most tragic victim of Catherine's twisted maternal protection was her daughter Marguerite, whose marriage to Henri of Navarre had been the centerpiece of the trap that led to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Marguerite found herself caught between her mother's political schemes and her husband's Protestant cause, trusted by neither side and used by both as a pawn in games she had never wanted to play. Princess Marguerite's personal letters from this period reveal a young woman who had been completely destroyed by her role in her mother's political machinations. She writes about the guilt of knowing that her wedding celebration had been used to lure thousands of innocent people to their deaths, about the shame of being married to a man her mother considered an enemy, and about the constant fear that she herself might become expendable if Catherine's political calculations changed. Marguerite spent her final years as a virtual prisoner in various castles, abandoned by her husband, despised by Catholic extremists who saw her as tainted by Protestant association, and viewed by her own mother as a political liability whose continued existence created more problems than it solved. The daughter Catherine had once hoped would strengthen royal alliances through marriage, became instead another casualty of the destructive political environment her mother had created. Even Catherine's relationship with her grandchildren was poisoned by the legacy of violence and extremism that defined her reign. These young people grew up in a court where assassination was a routine political tool, where religious hatred was encouraged as patriotic duty, and where moral considerations were consistently subordinated to political advantage. Prince Louis, Catherine's grandson through her daughter Elizabeth, spent his childhood watching adults debate which of his relatives deserved to be murdered for political reasons. The boy who should have been learning statecraft and diplomacy was instead being educated in the fine points of organizing massacres and the proper techniques for eliminating political opponents without creating diplomatic complications. Louis's tutors reported that the prince showed disturbing signs of psychological damage from his exposure to the court environment Catherine had created. He displayed unusual cruelty toward animals, seemed to enjoy hearing about violent incidents, and showed no capacity for empathy or moral reasoning. Catherine had created a family environment so toxic that it was literally producing sociopaths in the next generation. The international diplomatic consequences of Catherine's reign provide another lens through which to understand the complete failure of her political project. She had always justified her extreme methods by claiming they were necessary to protect French interests and maintain the kingdom's position as a major European power. By the time of her death, France had become essentially a failed state that other European powers were actively planning to partition among themselves. The Spanish ambassador to Rome, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, maintained extensive correspondence with his government about the opportunities that French political collapse was creating for Spanish expansion. His letters revealed detailed discussions about which French territories Spain should claim once the kingdom finally disintegrated completely, which French nobles might be willing to accept Spanish patronage in exchange for local autonomy, and how Spanish influence could be extended throughout former French territories. Cardinal Farnese's analysis was particularly damaging because it came from someone who had initially supported Catherine's persecution of French Protestants. The cardinal had believed that religious unity would strengthen France and make it a more reliable ally for Catholic powers. By the 1580s, he was reporting to Madrid that Catherine's methods had made France so weak and chaotic that it no longer qualified as a serious European power. Similar assessments were being made in London, where English officials were discussing how to take advantage of French weakness to expand English influence in areas where the two kingdoms had traditionally competed. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth I's principal secretary, maintained a network of agents throughout France who reported on the continuing deterioration of royal authority and the growing possibility that the kingdom might simply cease to exist as a unified political entity. These English intelligence reports provide fascinating insights into how completely Catherine's reign had damaged France's international reputation. English agents described a kingdom where central government had essentially ceased to function, where local strongmen controlled territory through pure military force, and where ordinary citizens had lost all confidence in the possibility of effective political leadership. The economic data from this period tells an equally devastating story about the practical consequences of Catherine's political choices. Tax revenues that had once funded one of Europe's most sophisticated administrative systems had fallen to levels that made basic government operations impossible. The commercial networks that had made France wealthy were disrupted by constant warfare and religious persecution. Agricultural productivity had declined as farming communities were repeatedly devastated by military campaigns. Jean-Baptiste Mercier was a royal tax collector in the province of Burgundy, who maintained detailed records of his attempts to gather revenue for Catherine's government during her final years. His account books reveal the complete collapse of the fiscal system that had once been the foundation of French royal power. Mercier's records show that by 1588, he was able to collect less than 20% of the taxes that had been routinely gathered just a decade earlier. The remaining 80% was lost to a combination of factors directly traceable to Catherine's policies: communities too devastated by religious warfare to pay taxes, merchants who had fled the kingdom to escape persecution, agricultural regions that had been depopulated by military campaigns, and local strongmen who simply refused to recognize royal authority. The tax collector's personal observations provide a ground-level view of how Catherine's political failures translated into practical consequences for ordinary French people. Mercier describes visiting villages that had been completely abandoned, finding prosperous farms reduced to burned ruins, and encountering surviving residents who were so traumatized by decades of violence that they no longer trusted any representative of royal authority. These economic consequences created a downward spiral that made political recovery increasingly difficult. As royal revenues declined, Catherine's government became less able to maintain the military forces necessary to impose order. As order collapsed, economic activity declined further, reducing revenues even more. The kingdom was trapped in a cycle of political and economic decay that seemed impossible to break. But perhaps the most damning evidence of Catherine's failure comes from examining what happened to the very community she had claimed to be protecting through her persecution of Protestant minorities. French Catholic communities that had initially supported religious persecution as necessary for their own security found themselves increasingly victimized by the climate of violence and extremism that Catherine's policies had created. The city of Toulouse provides a particularly clear example of how Catherine's approach to religious conflict ultimately harmed the Catholic communities it was supposed to protect. Toulouse had been a center of Catholic orthodoxy, where Protestant minorities had faced discrimination and occasional violence even before Catherine's reign began. Local Catholic leaders had enthusiastically supported her escalation of religious persecution, believing it would strengthen their community's position. Father Michel Carrier was the prior of Saint-Cernin Abbey in Toulouse, and his correspondence reveals how completely Catholic expectations about religious persecution had proven wrong. Instead of strengthening Catholic unity and security, Catherine's policies had created an environment where Catholic extremists competed with each other for ideological purity, often targeting fellow Catholics who were deemed insufficiently zealous. Father Carrier describes watching his own religious community tear itself apart as different factions accused each other of secret Protestant sympathies, insufficient commitment to religious warfare, or excessive willingness to compromise with political moderates. The abbey that had once been a center of scholarly religious discussion became a battleground where monks spent more time denouncing each other than studying scripture or serving their community. The economic consequences for Catholic communities were equally devastating. Toulouse's economy had been built on trade relationships that included Protestant merchants from other regions of France and Protestant trading partners in foreign countries. Catherine's persecution destroyed these commercial networks, leaving even Catholic merchants impoverished and unable to maintain the charitable and religious institutions that had been central to their community identity. Guillaume Navarre was a Catholic cloth merchant in Toulouse, who had initially supported religious persecution because he believed it would eliminate Protestant competition for his business. By 1585, Guillaume was writing desperate letters to relatives in other cities, describing how the destruction of trade networks had made his profession impossible, regardless of religious considerations. Guillaume's business records show the practical consequences of Catherine's policies for ordinary Catholic families. The merchant, who had once employed dozens of workers and supported multiple charitable institutions, was reduced to subsistence-level trading that barely supported his own family. The Catholic community that persecution was supposed to strengthen had been economically devastated by the very policies intended to protect it. Similar stories played out in Catholic communities throughout France, revealing how completely Catherine had misunderstood the interconnected nature of French society and economy. Her assumption that Catholics could benefit from Protestant persecution ignored the reality that French communities were economically and socially integrated in ways that made it impossible to harm one religious group without damaging the entire social fabric. The intellectual consequences of Catherine's reign were equally devastating for French Catholic institutions that had once been centers of European learning and theological scholarship. The University of Paris, which had been one of Europe's most prestigious centers of Catholic intellectual life, was transformed into something resembling a propaganda factory, where scholarship was subordinated to political and religious orthodoxy. Professor Thomas Briot had been a respected theologian at the Sorbonne, known for his sophisticated commentaries on medieval philosophy and his efforts to engage intellectually with the theological questions raised by Protestant reformers. During Catherine's reign, Professor Briot was forced to abandon this scholarly work in favor of producing inflammatory pamphlets that portrayed Protestants as demonic enemies deserving extermination. Professor Briot's private journals reveal his despair at watching the intellectual tradition he had devoted his life to serving degenerate into crude propaganda. He describes the shame of being forced to teach students to hate rather than think, the frustration of being unable to pursue genuine theological inquiry, and the growing conviction that Catherine's policies were fundamentally anti-intellectual and therefore anti-Christian. The professor's experience was typical of Catholic intellectuals throughout France, who found their scholarly pursuits corrupted by the demands of religious warfare. Libraries that had been centers of learning were purged of books deemed potentially heretical. Universities that had encouraged theological debate became centers of indoctrination. The sophisticated Catholic intellectual tradition that had been one of France's greatest cultural achievements was systematically destroyed by the very government that claimed to be protecting it. Meanwhile, the Protestant communities that survived Catherine's persecution were developing exactly the kinds of intellectual and cultural institutions that French Catholic institutions were losing. Huguenot communities in cities like La Rochelle and Montauban became centers of innovative education that emphasized critical thinking, scientific inquiry, and the kind of theological scholarship that French Catholic institutions had abandoned. Pastor Jean Despenser was a Protestant minister and scholar who had fled France during the worst periods of persecution, but maintained correspondence with friends in both Protestant and Catholic communities. His letters provide a unique perspective on how religious persecution was actually strengthening Protestant intellectual life while weakening Catholic scholarship. Pastor Despenser describes how Protestant communities in exile had been forced to develop sophisticated theological arguments to defend their beliefs against Catholic attacks, while Catholic institutions had become intellectually lazy because they could rely on government persecution rather than scholarly argument to maintain their position. The persecution that was supposed to eliminate Protestant intellectual challenges had actually made Protestant scholarship more rigorous, while making Catholic scholarship more superficial. This intellectual reversal represented another way in which Catherine's policies had achieved the opposite of their intended effects. Instead of strengthening Catholic intellectual dominance, religious persecution had created conditions where Protestant communities were producing more innovative and sophisticated theological work than their Catholic counterparts. The long-term consequences of this intellectual damage extended far beyond Catherine's lifetime. France, which had been positioned to lead European Catholic intellectual development during the Renaissance, instead fell behind other Catholic countries that had managed to maintain scholarly traditions without resorting to violent persecution of intellectual opponents. The artistic and cultural damage inflicted by Catherine's reign was similarly extensive and long-lasting. The Renaissance court culture that had made France a center of European artistic innovation was replaced by an environment where creative expression was subordinated to political and religious propaganda requirements. Pierre Ronsard, who had been one of the most celebrated poets of the French Renaissance, found himself unable to continue the kind of innovative literary work that had made him famous. His later poetry, produced during Catherine's reign, lacks the intellectual sophistication and emotional depth that had characterized his earlier work, reflecting the constraints imposed by a political environment that viewed artistic independence as potentially subversive. Ronsard's correspondence with fellow artists reveals the devastating impact of political repression on creative communities. He describes how poets, painters, musicians, and other artists were forced to choose between artistic integrity and physical safety, how cultural patronage had been redirected toward propaganda production, and how the intellectual freedom necessary for genuine artistic achievement had been eliminated by the climate of fear and censorship that Catherine's government had created. The architectural projects that had been transforming French cities into showcases of Renaissance design were abandoned as resources were diverted to military fortifications. And the skilled craftsmen who had been building chateaux and churches fled the kingdom to escape religious persecution. The physical landscape of France began to reflect the cultural and intellectual impoverishment that Catherine's policies had created. Master mason Jacques-Androuet du Cerceau had been responsible for some of the most impressive architectural achievements of the French Renaissance, including work on the Louvre Palace and several magnificent chateaux throughout the kingdom. During Catherine's reign, du Cerceau found himself increasingly restricted to military engineering projects as the government's priorities shifted from cultural achievement to warfare and fortification. Du Cerceau's architectural drawings from this period show a dramatic decline in both ambition and sophistication compared to his earlier work. The elegant proportions and innovative design elements that had characterized French Renaissance architecture were replaced by crude functionality, designed to serve military rather than aesthetic purposes. The visual environment that French people inhabited was becoming as impoverished as their intellectual and cultural life. Catherine de Medici, the woman who clawed her way from despised foreign bride to the most feared ruler in Europe, ultimately destroyed everything she claimed to be protecting. The merchant's daughter, who dreamed of proving herself worthy of a throne that never wanted her, ended up poisoning the very foundations of French civilization. Her story stands as one of history's most powerful warnings about what happens when ruthless ambition operates without moral constraints, and why the methods we use to gain power matter just as much as whether we succeed in getting it.